The world leaders are at war. Much of Europe, North America and even Asian leaders are fighting to the death, and this conflict would see over around 1,400,000 casualties. Global conflict, more modern firearms, weaponry, cannon fire, battleships. Land and at sea war would be raged. However, I'm talking about World War Zero. This is the 7 Years' War. Long before the first or second World War in the 18th century, a global conflict occurred. Many consider it to be the first global conflict, hence World War Zero. I'll be taking you on, quite briefly short actually, 5-part series, looking at how the war started, the events of the war, the battlefields, the turmoil, the political chaos, and the deaths, and then the aftermath of the conflict. This is the 7 Years' War, World War Zero. Hope you enjoy this series. The 7 Years' War series has begun. However, apologies for false advertising, but indeed this video is pivotal in understanding why the 7 Years' War actually occurred in the first place. Knowing the cause is very important in understanding the event and the consequences of history. And this is leading off from the Spanish War of Succession, the Austrian War of Succession, beginning on the 16th of December 1740 and lasting all the way through to the 18th of October 1748, just 8 years before the 7 Years' War began. This was very much a prelude to that war, in which the French and their allies tried to secure more of an influence in Europe, whether the British were seeking to use it as a catalyst and a springboard into securing global hegemony and domination. Sources are linked down in the description. Let's begin the Austrian War of Succession, leading on of course to the 7 Years' War, which was going to come afterwards. Although the Austrian War of Succession actually, spoiler alert, saw very little territorial changes, only of Prussian control of Silesia secured by Frederick the Great and northern Italian territory ceded to the Spanish, it very much was stirring the pot for a future, much larger European and later global World War Zero conflict. That phrase, coined by Winston Churchill himself, thought I'd established that, it is actually in the name of the series. So how did this war, the war to begin the war, the other war around the series, that's not confusing, is it, begin? Well, by this idea of a pragmatic sanction. That's a very posh word you would not hear anyone say at all nowadays, or any country use between them anymore in warfare, which is perhaps where the glory is missing. But that is a pragmatic sanction. Effectively, to put in layman's terms, it's very complicated, but it was effectively a doctrine, a sort of unwritten rule, if you like, just being written, about maintaining sort of a fair amount of Austrian influence in Central Europe. However, it was basically, well, for France, even Britain actually, but basically all European powers not really liking that. It was basically a sort of pragmatic sanction, was sort of saying Austria should have control of much of and a lot of influence over Central Europe, but no one was really happy with that, particularly Frederick the Great, who had just taken Silesia and wanted to expand more into this Holy Roman Empire and Austrian territory. The leaders of Europe at the time of the 1740 was Louis XV of France, King George II of the UK, and oh yeah, just a side note on King George II of the UK, as you'll find out in just a second, he was the last English monarch to lead their troops into battle in 1743. So I just mentioned that. And of course Marie Theresa and Francis I of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip V of Spain, Frederick I of Sweden, and the Dutch William IV. At this time, the British, as you can see on this map here, had control of Minorca, which was a key strategic point along with Gibraltar and later of course Malta, Cyprus and the Suez Canal, hence why they had a lot of control of the Mediterranean Sea, and why of course the idea of the pragmatic sanction was already beginning to be challenged, because the Austrians at the time of course had control of the stretch of sea between Italy and Croatia, the Yugoslavic region. The British were enclosing into that, and Italy, many of the Italian states, Italy of course not unified yet, didn't like this either. Then the first major battle of the conflict was the Battle of Dettingen on the 27th of June 1743, and it was a very large force, 35,000 Allied soldiers against the 23,000 French, where King George II saw himself lead his final troops ever in terms of national monarch into battle. However, it was a decisive Allied victory, albeit at the cost of 6,500 casualties, and was already challenging any French hopes of securing more influence on the continent. However, the Austrians and the French had an ace up their sleeve, and yet again it would be the English realising the greatest threat to a war was not the war itself, but back home. Although a small island nation, it has got several nations in that small island nation, and the Scottish, unlike in fact that the old Stuart dynasty has ended and they've got the new Hanoverian dynasty, that's of course Germanic, not Scottish, they did not like this. So they basically aided Bobby Prince Charlie to try and invade England and pretend on the throne, who, if in control of England, would be sympathetic to France and Austria and would hopefully pull out of the war. However, did this not occur in any way, shape or form, as King George II, along with the Duke of Cumberland, was very quick to react, and just outside Inverness at the Battle of Culloden on 16th April 1746, it would be yet again another Allied, or particularly in this case the UK victory, at just 2,300 casualties and many Jacobites being killed in the battle. So once the domestic situation had been secured, it was only really going to be smooth sailing. Or would it, from this point for the Allies? Well, not entirely. The Battle of Fortinay on the 11th of May 1745, although now 5 years into the conflict, was actually a French victory, although again 20,000 casualties. And at this point many of the battles was occurring on the continent, but at each blow, Austria, even Sweden and the French were getting weaker, where the British and their allies were getting stronger, and Prussia was controlling more and more control. And militaristically and politically, Frederick the Great was becoming even more stronger and securing his place as potentially a great military strategist. So indeed, in 1748, after the French ceded some territory in India from Great Britain, the war did come to an end, in which minus those few territorial changes to begin with, all former territories were ceded back. So the British got control of the territory, France taking from them, etc., etc. However, this Austrian War Succession would result in 380,000 casualties, and ultimately, because there were so little territorial changes, and now the Spanish had control over the Habsburg dynasties and Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire being ruled by a Habsburg, many people were unhappy with this and wanted potentially even destruction of all of the Holy Roman Empire. So another war would have to be done justice in order to secure this, and that would later come. France, Austria, and even Prussia and Russia had to prove themselves again, whether Britain could realise that another war could prove very useful for gaining more influence in Southern Asia and Latin American territory. Although this, from the Spanish point of view, would prove futile in eventually the fall of their Spanish Empire, at least in the Americas. So ultimately the War of the Austrian Succession saw around 380,000 people killed for only the reason of more paperwork being done for a future war to occur. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this 7 years war leading up to, during and after cause, event, consequence series. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.